everyone. Hope you're having a great day so far. Today we're going to be talking, going into a little more depth about utilizing your custom fields. So before we get into the presentation, just a couple housekeeping items. We will be sending a recording of the webinar to you all after. It takes about a week just to get to you guys, so look next Tuesday and it'll be there. And we are going to be doing a Q&A session at the end. Feel free to post your questions throughout the webinar. We just won't be answering them till after. And now I'll pass it over to Sharon.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time today to attend this webinar. So what we're going to be looking at, as Sarah very kindly mentioned, was how to get the most out of your custom fields. Some of you may know me already. I'm one of the platform solutions managers. I also tend to cover a lot of training. So this is something that I wanted to show you how you can update individual fields using configuration mode. Some of you may already know this. However, I wanted to look at this from a particular angle of client applicant feedback, from things that you may have come across once you've passed the implementation stage, suggestions, questions that may not have occurred to you in your previous process. So I wanted to look at that and just how flexible the platform can be and some best practices around this. So even if you've done this before, I think it's no harm to have an idea of best practices. Maybe there might be some new options here that you may not have seen before. So something I come across a lot of the time is you may have an implementation cycle or your application requirements. And as time goes on, sometimes the requirements may change subtly, or you realize that applicants may benefit from just maybe an extra line of information that they may not think about otherwise. They may not be very familiar with the process, and even a link to some basic guidelines can be very, very helpful. So configuration mode means that you can make changes to the display of the field, to the information surrounding the field, without feeling any fear of damaging the data that's being received or how the field should function in itself. Because of course, when you're new to a system, making changes to a field can be quite nerve-wracking. And of course, obviously you want to make sure that you do it in such a way that benefits everyone and doesn't cause future work for yourself as well. So this way, there are definitely options to make the system more robust and to make changes that will last into the future. So I'm going to be going through a few of those sort of do's and don'ts, best practices, recommended, due diligence, that kind of thing. So use case explanation. I usually find in my experience that the best way to find out how intuitive an application is give someone a very short deadline to complete it. Because that's when people are in a rush, close to deadline, they usually have some kind of block with maybe a requirement, an upload, anything like that. And also, once they've submitted the application, oftentimes they may be unsure of what would happen next, if there's something they would need to prepare, or anything along those lines. Even something as simple as, how long does a review process take? So all of those we can look through here. And I'm sure the benefits are fairly self-explanatory, but the easier your communication, the easier your system is going to be to use. It means as well that when you bring in new staff members to your team, or someone who may be taking over different responsibilities, a lot of these instructions, which you can create for internal or external users, are already available. So it means that in terms of knowledge transfer, you're making it much more accessible for anybody else to take it forward. And as well, it means that the more instructions, the more information you can include, the more accessible you can make your system, and that can make it easier for everybody. As our accessibility specialist once said, instructions are helpful to people who don't need them, but they are vital to people who do. So anywhere that you can make life easier for your applicants and for yourselves by proxy, it's going to be very, very helpful. So I feel like the benefits of it, are fairly straightforward, but what actually matters in this case is the demo itself. So I'm going to tab into one of our demo systems and walk through some ways that I might make the features a little bit more intuitive, maybe make it a little easier to look at going forward. We do have quite a bit of time for questions, especially if anyone has any kind of questions regarding specific requirements, and we can definitely walk through some of those as well. But I'm going to mouse into our demo instance here. So a couple of things before we actually dig into the features itself. One thing I would say is if you are uncertain as to whether you want the changes you're making to be permanent or you're new to configuration, what I would always suggest is going to your instance and making sure that you can access the backup instance. So what that is, you can see here in my URL that there is a BK appended to SmartSimple, and you'll also see an orange banner labeled backup along the top. What this is, if you haven't seen it before, it's a hot backup. So it's overwritten every night by your live instance. It's essentially somewhere where you can log in, try something new. If you like the results, you can replicate it in live, and then it will be in your system. If you don't like it or the results don't turn out as you expected, you can simply leave it there and it will be overwritten every night. So for anyone new to the system, I strongly recommend trying anything you're new to on the backup instance. Even if you are fairly certain as to how it will go, I find it's much more helpful for your own due diligence. The other thing I would say is, if you're curious as to, if there's more to a particular field or feature than you might see on first glance, I would definitely recommend having the wiki available as well, wiki.smartsimple.com. This is somewhere, for example, if I wanted to enter a field type in here and see what was available, I would get a lot more information here as to the possible capabilities. For the most part, what we're going to be looking at here is just making fields more intuitive. So just adding little bits of information as you go. So I'm in one of our instances. I'm going to pick a random grant and I'm just going to look at it. So if I pick, for example, this one down here, this one is one of our examples of a corporate giving grant. And the platform is pretty agnostic as to what kind of information it's going to receive. It's all going to be tracked in a particular way, and you can edit it in a specific fashion. So let's say that I'm navigating through this and I see the project summary right here. These are okay in captions, I suppose, but maybe I want to give an applicant a bit more information. Like if I was a first-time applicant, my project description, I might not know whether that was referring to execution, demographics, or anything like that. And oftentimes you can save them a lot of confusion in that sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my options. So a couple of things with this. You need to access this, you would need to have administrator access to wherever you are. So being a system administrator is most common. The record you're looking at would need to be in edit mode, and you open up options and you can see configuration mode down here. So when I open this up, it's going to do several things. First, it's going to make it so that I can no longer enter data into this particular application. Second, it's going to give me a little configuration mode at the top, which I can turn on or off. Next, every field I hover over will highlight blue, which will allow me to click it, open it, and make those changes. And finally, I'll see some extra configuration shortcuts on the right. So a couple of things with configuration mode, of course. If I make a change to this particular field, that field will be changed wherever it displays. So there's no way to make a change that only appears on one particular application type. And the other thing I would mention is that if you're planning to make changes that are more complex or far-reaching than simple display or formatting, I would definitely recommend a couple of checks, which we can go through here as well. I think we should have time. But as you can see here, I've got my configuration mode at the top. If I want to end it, just clicking the X here gets me out, or I'd click my options, configuration mode again. Any field I hover over, including tabs, can highlight blue. I can click that, it opens up my settings. And on the right, I have my different shortcuts as well. So if I wanted to include variable syntax, if I wanted to look at my submit buttons, if I wanted to go deeper into any of the fields that we're looking at. As well, something you may or may not be aware of, a new feature of configuration mode is if I want to see what happens when I click a specific button, I can actually go into configuration mode. If I hover over it and it highlights blue and I click it, it will give me the actual process from where it goes from and to, and I can go into much more detail with my full flow. Bit of a side note, but I do find it helpful to note. So from here, let's say that I just want to update the project description. So if I click this to open it, I can see right now that I have all of my custom field settings here. A couple of things before you get into it in depth. Over on the top right, you may see a toggle called Advanced Options. For the most part, I would say if you're new to this, I would leave that toggled off until you maybe don't find what you're looking for. The reason for that is Advanced Options, as the name implies, includes all of the menu items, some of which may not be very frequently used. And if you're getting used to a new system, having this toggled off will give you the most commonly used features, which for the most part would probably be what you're looking at. So that's where I would begin with that. So backup and then toggle off Advanced Options. And the next thing with any of this, before you get into any changes, is the best habit I find you can get into with any of this is leaving notes as to what you did wherever you did. Just because what seems like it might be self-explanatory to you might not be the case 3 months down the road. And something as simple as do not delete on a particular field might save someone a good bit of hassle that way. Even if you're working on backup, I find getting into the practice of leaving a description saying demo purposes, something along those lines, that can be very helpful. So there are 2 ways you can leave notes as to what you did. Description, which is here, will not display to the external user. And I often find this is good for anything that's a quick glance type of piece of information. The other thing you can do on the left is go to notes. This allows you to leave notes. So in this case, updated formatting for demo purposes. When I save this, it will date and timestamp it. And that way, if someone was to come in and see that there were changes made to this field, they would be able to see have a basic idea of what they were and whether they could be reversed or not. So even writing what you're attempting to do is very helpful. So we'll go through some of the general settings here just for a bit of context. So starting from the top, the custom field ID here, this is the unique identifier of the field. You could reference this field elsewhere by putting this ID between 2 @ tags and it would show the value. However, as you can imagine, if I was to put this in some kind of piece of text like reference field ID 1657132, I might not know exactly what that's referring to. So a lot of the time, we would often use the field name. So the field name is another way to identify the field, usually via text. And for that reason, the field name is usually best left as is. So this is not necessarily what displays to the applicant, it's the way we would describe the field, whereas the caption is actually what displays to the user. So if you're ever concerned about which to change, captions you can change as many times as you wish. Field names, I would pause before making that change unless you have to, and I would also do a quick check to see that it's not in use anywhere else. We can get into that as well. The field type here. So this is really helpful to know about because depending on the field type you select, you can change what kind of information the field receives, and as well as that, how to report on it. So a lot of these fields receive different types of text, so multiple line, single line, number, phone number, date, email, etc. If a field has already been created, it's not recommended to change the field type if you can help it. Usually it's best to create another one if you need to address a particular requirement. And when it comes to field types, if you are creating your own, I tend to keep 3 concepts at top of mind. So the first one is reportability. How easy is it going to be to report on this field? Do you need to pull it out in any list views, anything like that? Second, security. Do you have any kind of sensitive information here? Is it going to need to be audited, anything like that? And then as well as that, scalability or volume. So how often will you need to use this, reference this? Who has to see it? How many people have to see it? Things like that. So the common input types, all listed here. Again, you can always go into the wiki and look further for any of this information. You also have the option to include extra tabs, extra title bars, all of those. The display order just indicates where it's going to show up on the form. So the higher the number, the further down it is. Usually these are incremented by 100, just because it's not recommended for more than one field to have the same display order. I'm going to ignore default value. Default value, as the name implies, means that if you were to populate that, the field would not require a user to update it. It would presume that that was the default option. But the display here is what we're really looking at. So from an accessibility perspective, the best way to set up your display is single column layout with the caption above the field, any instructions, information you might include with minimal use of color. So that means it will be most compatible with the screen reader. However, there's still a lot you can do within this. So let's say that I wanted to give some more information with this. So we can see that there are 3 ways to provide information: instructions, placeholder text, and tooltip. These are really helpful, and I definitely recommend having instructions as you go, rather than having logic at the end to tell a user, wait, you need to do it this way or this way. Just because from a user experience perspective, it's nicer to be told as you're doing it rather than once you've done all the work. So in this case, I'm going to include some instructions here. So what's neat about these instructions is I could paste that information in here. That's nice. But I can also include some extra information, like, let's say I wanted to give them a link to maybe a file that they wanted to download. So I could give them maybe a reference. So please download our guidelines. So I'll do something like this. Now, obviously that's not a real link. So what I would do for something like that is take something out of smart folders, for example. And you can also include syntax with this. As this is a type application, you need to for example, you can include variables from the project in here, either from the applicant or the user. We can walk through how you can see those as well. You can include links to files. You can even have some formatting in here as well. However, I would generally avoid formatting where possible, just because it often does create more work for yourself. Placeholder text seems obvious, but often I find it's quite helpful to even include a symbol of what you should be including. So if it's placeholder text, type here. If it was a percentage, I would include a percentage symbol. If it was a dollar amount or a currency, I would include that currency denominator. The tooltip here will populate this little question mark here. They're great. The only thing I would say is that usually that's for the type of information that you would need if you were, quite new to a system. So not something that your average user might need, but maybe a new user might need. And it also very much depends on your user type. So some individuals are all about finding out as much information as they can. Some might not be. One thing I will say about information and instructions is that generally they're more effective provided in little and often. Just because if it's a large block of text, it's quite difficult to scan. So the more information you can kind of dole out as they progress through the application, the easier it's going to be. Width, full, large, medium, or small, pretty straightforward. Validation, mandatory. You can set a minimum and maximum length. Show the counter and count words, or if I was to take this off, count characters. You can have an exceeded maximum message. It's not mandatory. It will still validate for that regardless. And if this was a field that you would need to audit or find out any kind of previous entries into this, you can always select track changes. That will provide a full history of the entries into that field for that record. One thing I'd also say about instructions is that generally I try to recommend keeping them as dynamic and as applicable as possible. So trying not to get overly specific to a particular year or type, or anything like that. Anything that should be changed could be mostly dynamic in terms of guidelines, for example. And the other thing I would check as well is under permissions and availability, I would see whether it was available for a specific type or not. So this one has been built on what we call on a foundation type. So it's only for that particular type, but sometimes depending on how many application types you may have, that may change. So that's a general overview of how I would customize a particular field. So let's see how it looks. So I'll click save, close this, and I'm just going to reload my frame. So now I'm just going to close configuration mode and go to my project summary tab. So great, okay. So now I can see there's my instructions. There's my tooltip, same thing. And I also included a variable syntax there. So it included a type, so foundation application. There's my guidelines link. So obviously that one is a fake link, but the reference works. Incidentally, if anyone is curious as to how to build those, w3schools.com helps you with all of that. So there's no need to learn any of that. We can see type here. If I type, my word count goes down. Excellent. And that's one way that I can make this a little bit more intuitive. So I'm happy to take questions at this point, or I can go into the variable syntax part, depending on what people would like to hear.
Great, thanks, Sharon. We do have a couple questions, so maybe we can do those first, and then if we have time, we can go back and do the syntax.
Perfect.
Could you remind me how to hide but not delete custom fields that might not be active currently?
Yes, good question. That is a really good question because it's something that comes up quite a bit. So that's something that definitely worth thinking about if a field is no longer in use. A couple things I would do. First, put in a description just to say no longer in use, just so it's clear. But then all you would need to do is go to the role field permissions under permissions and availability and select deny role access. That's it. That's all you need to do. And then it will no longer appear on the form. It's not gone from the system. The data is still in there. And if you ever need to reinstate it, you can simply clear that field.
Awesome, thank you.
Nice.
With the track changes toggle, does the system only track changes that have been saved draft, or any edits?
Good question. So the audit trail shows any changes that have been stored. So if someone made a ton of different changes but didn't save any of them, they wouldn't be stored.
Okay. If you have 3 fields with display order 100, 200, 300, how would you display these on a particular in the order 300, 100, 200?
Ooh, I like that question. So there is a way around that, which in the old days, it would have been the case where if you wanted to change the display, you'd have to go in and manually update each number. You do not have to do that anymore. So let's say that you know where these fields are and you know what they're called. If you went into configuration mode and clicked custom fields over on the right here, I'm going to show you something really cool. Let's say that it's, these top 3 fields, for example. If I navigate over to this bulleted list icon here, which is just titled Enable Reorder, and click it, that allows me to drag and drop these fields around. So that way I don't have to reorder any of these. And if I hold down the Shift key, I can just select a bunch and move them around. Again, I would try this on backup first and make sure you can see how it looks before trying it on live, but that's something you can do. You can also re-index everything by 100, especially if you're playing around with the order of fields, but that would be how I would do it.
Can you also put a 0 in the display? That is to hide the fields?
Oh, that is how we used to build, and that was something that was in a visibility condition. Here you can actually see that. We don't recommend that anymore, mainly because it will still put weight on the variable processor. So what's better configuration now is to change the permissions to deny role access and clear any visibility conditions.
Is there a way to copy a custom field, say when you want to hide a small change and then make the old field hidden?
So it would Actually, I'm curious about that. Would that person be willing to give any more information? Like, as in, it's just a slight change of information, but they want to just hide the old version, or?
I've taken down their who it was, and if they want to send more information, or we can maybe email them after.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Sorry, I'm more curious because while you can save a field, any field, as a new field, it's more a case of if the field is very similar to the initial one, there might be other ways to handle those changes. So I just want to be aware of the context there.
Yep. Awesome. They send something in. We make changes to annual reporting and want to hold old versions the same, but make changes without rebuilding fields.
Got it. So what I would do there is I would run a kind of review or audit of the fields and the changes that need to happen. And depending on the scale of the changes, I might suggest looking at versioning to, preserve the old types if the changes are significant enough. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend building new fields every single year. I think that would be just a lot of work.
If you deny view field on a field, will it hide the field on all versions? And if it does, how would you hide a field on the current version?
Ooh, I like this question. Okay, so whatever version you were on for that field, the settings you put there are only for that version. So there's no way to put a setting up that impacts all versions. Whatever one you're on, that will be there. So I'm actually not sure if we have versioning on this particular system or if everyone on the call is aware of what that is. Essentially, a version is a copy of all of the custom fields in a record set, and you can make changes to each of those individual versions. And let me just check if there's one here, but we might not have that, but I think that could be a really good topic for a future discussion as well. But yeah, so the changes you make, whatever version you're on, they will only impact that version.
Okay. How can you show how to see where a field is being used?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So this is a really good question because it's going to save a lot of concern over time. So let's say that I want to change my project title. I want to see if it's in use anywhere. So if I went back into my record in configuration mode and opened this, up at the top, we have a series of options which are very worthwhile knowing about. So translation, fair enough, but the next one here, search reference, is what we're looking for. So what this will do is it will search the system for this field name. So this will only work with the stored field name. So if you were to change the field name and then search it, obviously it's not going to give you the same results as before. So if I click this, I can see that this one is currently in use in a formula. So this will tell you if it's in use in a formula, a workflow email, maybe even referenced in a field elsewhere. But if you open this up and it's blank, that means it is not referenced anywhere else. The thing is that if you were to change this and you knew that it was referenced elsewhere, what you would need to do is go to that reference and update that one as well, if that's what you needed to do. So that's how you would check. And I would definitely run that before making any changes to any field.
If you want to add a link to a file or perhaps a website in the field instructions, do you have to have the file or website link saved to Smart Folder first?
Ooh, good question. So not necessarily. So essentially with any instructions we have here, you could, if you were going to link to an external website, the only thing you would need to do is make sure in the URL reference that you have target equals blank so that it goes to a new tab. Because as long as it doesn't try to load within the frame of the application, because that's going to throw up an error. So that's something to be aware of. If you were going to include a Smart Folder link, I'm just going to duplicate my tab and show how I would do that. So I'd go to my Smart Folders under Tools, pick a document, doesn't matter, there's my sample documents. Take whichever one is necessary here. You can see the drop down next to each file. You can see view URL. So what I would do is take everything from the end of the .com here, copy that, and then I would put that in the actual guidelines here. So if we actually looked at this and we pop it into this line here. So if I was to save that, now if I was to get out and reload my frame, there's my guidelines. So that should probably be a direct link to download, but you get the idea. Any kind of information you can provide in instructions or anything like that, going to be very, very helpful.
Great. Can you copy all custom fields to build in a new application?
Well, you don't actually have to. So let's say that you built a new application type in the same, for example, submission manager, grants manager, anything like that. All of the fields are already available. So all you would need to do is go into however many fields that you're looking at, make sure that the permissions are set that they're either available to all types or to update the inclusion to allow for the new type you've created. So for example, this one here, we can see grant type availability. So if I was to create a new grant type, I would just make sure to either leave it blank, which selects everything, or select all of the different ones here. And that would be it.
Can you use the search reference to see if the field is pulled in a report?
That would be a great enhancement. Currently, that's not the case, but I would love that to be an enhancement.
When displaying a custom field, how can you make this the product of two other custom fields? For example, field 1 equals 200, field 2 equals 100, display field 3 equals 1 minus 2.
Mm-hmm. You can do that. It's a little bit more advanced, but what that would be, how to do that would be something along the lines of, let's say, just open this up and create a new field. So in this case, it would likely be a special calculated field, and you might need to use some SS logic with that. So it wouldn't necessarily be a common input type unless you were to use you could use a text box single line and have it populated either by a formula, or you could have it as a computed calculated number and actually have the values in here. So again, this is one of those context-specific questions where you could have it function one way or the other. It depends on when you need this result and where it needs to show up. So in general, I usually find with those kind of calculations, usually we run them with template formulas just so that they load when you load the record and you don't have to save it. Whereas a calculated number, you would need to store it to calculate it.
Is the instructions file type different than the instruction field setting?
Good question. So yes, the instructions is a special input type as well. It's a display control type here, display instructions. Those are really helpful if you want to provide blocks of dedicated instruction text. I do find those very helpful, both internal and external purposes. The only thing I'd say about display instructions is just that to be mindful of permissions. So if you're setting them up for internal or external, just so that the right individuals can see them. The other thing to be aware of with instructions is that when I close configuration mode, this little eye over here shows or hides instructions. So something to usually keep in mind. But the display instructions field is a field type just like any other. I find it helpful if you want to provide more kind of front and center generic application instructions, but on a field by field basis, I think the instructions field is very, very helpful. The reason I would steer away from using a large display instructions type to cover everything is because I have had experience with a client who their applicants were not getting the requirements. And the reason for that was they were skipping over the instructions because unfortunately they thought they were terms and conditions. So that's why I usually recommend keeping them spaced out little and often.
How will the reordering impact different versions in the display order?
So with reordering fields, that would only impact the version that you're in. So it wouldn't impact the other versions.
So, great. Is it possible when adding the link to a document, so when they click the link, it will open up in a new web browser window?
Yes, provided that you use the target equals blank syntax, yeah.
Great. All right, Sharon, I think that's all the questions we have today.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone for your participation, and hope everyone stays safe out there.
Have a great day, everyone.
Have a great day. Take care.